Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow, as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften, like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. The train rocked gently as it pulled away from the platform, a low metallic rhythm settling in beneath everything else. Priya stood near the door, at first holding the pole with one hand, her bag resting against her hip. The car wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. People were spaced out in their own small bubbles, eyes down, headphones on each body, moving with the shared motion of the ride. She found an open seat by the window and sat tucking her feet slightly under the bench. Outside, the city slid past in layers brick, glass, concrete, then a blur of lights as the train picked up speed. The motion was familiar enough to be comforting, but not enough to feel like home. Priya was 28 and worked as a data analyst for a company she liked well enough. The work made sense to her. Patterns, numbers, quiet focus. It was the rest of life that often felt harder to place. Conversations that moved too fast. Rooms where everyone else seemed to know where they belonged. Decisions that felt heavier than they looked on paper. She rested her forehead briefly against the cool window glass and watched her reflection drift in and out over the darkening city. It always surprised her how clearly she could feel present and out of place at the same time. Like she was there doing everything required but slightly off-center, as if she'd arrived without the final instruction. The train slowed near the next stop, brakes sighing softly. A few people stood to leave. Others took their seats. The space adjusted around her without asking. Earlier that day, Priya had been in a meeting where everyone spoke easily, tossing ideas back and forth like they were all holding the same map. She had followed along, contributed when needed, nodded at the right moments. No one excluded her. No one questioned her place. And still, when the meeting ended, she'd felt the familiar tug of doubt. A quiet sense that she was filling a seat that belonged to someone else, that eventually someone would notice the mismatch. She pulled her jacket closer around herself, not because she was cold, but because the pressure felt grounding. The train swayed again, steady and predictable, as if reminding everyone inside that they were being carried whether they tried to control it or not. Priya thought about a puzzle she'd worked on as a kid, one of those with hundreds of pieces scattered across the table. She remembered the feeling of scanning the shapes, convinced there had to be one missing. She'd checked the box, the floor under the couch. Only later did she realize the piece had been there the whole time, just turned the wrong way. That memory surfaced now without effort as the train moved her through tunnels and open air. She wondered how many times she'd treated herself like a missing piece when she was simply not yet oriented. The train emerged above ground lights spilling in through the windows. Buildings gave way to trees for a few moments, their branches streaking past. The rhythm of the ride smoothed her breathing without her noticing. In and out. Slow, uncounted breaths. Priya watched the people across from her. A woman scrolling through her phone. A man staring at the floor, jaw relaxed. Someone humming quietly beneath their breath. None of them seemed to be proving anything. None of them looked like they were trying to justify their presence on the train. They were just here. She felt a soft ache behind her ribs, the kind that came from wanting to belong without knowing where to place that want. For years, she'd believed belonging was something you earned by fitting in just right, saying the right things, choosing the right path, becoming a version of yourself that made sense to everyone else. But the train didn't ask for that. It didn't care who deserved a seat. It simply moved, carrying every passenger equally regardless of their stories. Priya shifted slightly and let her shoulders drop. The tension there eased just a fraction. She didn't feel suddenly included. She didn't feel whole in a dramatic way. What she felt was quieter. She felt less separate. The train slowed again, pulling into another station. Doors opened. Air rushed in. A few passengers stepped out. Others stepped in. The shape of the car changed, but the ride continued. Priya realized then how often she'd imagined herself as an extra piece, one that didn't quite fit anywhere. But nothing here felt like extra. The train had room. The bench had room. The moment had room. She rested her hands in her lap, palms open, fingers relaxed. The window reflected her face again, softer now, less questioned. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to solve herself before the next stop. Maybe she wasn't missing. Maybe she was already part of the picture, even if she couldn't see the full image yet. The thought stayed with her as the train carried her forward, steady and patient, into whatever came next. The train continued on, carrying Priya through neighborhoods she recognized and others she only knew by name. The movement was steady now, familiar enough that her body no longer braced for it. She rested back against the seat and let the window support the side of her head, watching lights pass in long, gentle streaks. She noticed how her thoughts had slowed, not disappeared, just softened around the edges. They no longer lined up to argue her place in the world. They floated in and out like reflections on the glass present, but not demanding. For most of her life, Priya had believed belonging was something external, a place you arrived at, a group that opened itself to you, a moment when everything finally clicked and you could say, "This is where I fit." Until then, she assumed she was incomplete, waiting for the missing piece that would make the picture whole. But sitting on the train surrounded by strangers who were not really strangers at all, she felt something shift. No one here knew her story. No one needed to. And still she was carried just the same. The idea settled quietly. Maybe belonging wasn't about fitting perfectly into a shape. Maybe it was about being held even temporarily by the same movement, the same moment, the same direction. The train dipped back underground, the windows turning into mirrors again. Priya caught her reflection and studied it without judgment. The face looking back didn't appear unfinished. It looked attentive, alive, in motion. She thought again about that childhood puzzle, about how the piece she'd been searching for had never been gone, only turned the wrong way. How easy it was to mistake orientation for absence. How often she'd done the same with herself. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She didn't reach for it. Whatever it was could wait. Right now, there was nothing she needed to confirm. The train slowed, then picked up speed again. The sound of wheels against rails created a low, even rhythm, almost like breathing. Priya matched her breath to it without trying. In, out, carried forward. She felt the familiar urge to evaluate herself begin to fade. Not because she had answered all her questions, but because the questions no longer felt urgent. There would be time for them later, if they mattered at all. When the announcement for her stop played, she didn't feel the usual jolt of uncertainty. She stood, moved toward the door, and stepped off with the others. The platform was cool and quiet, the air heavier than inside the car. The train doors closed behind her, and with a soft, mechanical sigh, it continued on without pause. Priya watched it disappear into the tunnel lights, shrinking until there was only darkness again. She felt a small pang then, not of loss, but of recognition. The train hadn't left her behind. It had simply completed its role. She walked up the stairs and out into the night. The street above was calm, washed in yellow light. A few people passed by, each absorbed in their own direction. No one questioned her presence. No one measured her pace. As she walked home, Priya realized something else. She had spent years trying to locate the place where she would finally belong, as if it were fixed and waiting. But belonging wasn't stationary. It moved. It shifted. It appeared wherever she allowed herself to be fully present without shrinking. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, setting her bag down gently. The apartment greeted her with familiar silence. She didn't rush to fill it. She let it stay quiet. Priya sat on the edge of the couch for a moment, hands resting loosely in her lap. Her body felt heavier now, in the way it does when it trusts the ground beneath it. The day loosened its grip. The doubts that usually followed her into the evening didn't seem to know where to land. She didn't suddenly feel complete in a dramatic sense, but she no longer felt like a piece waiting to be found. She lay down and let her breath settle. The image of the puzzle faded, replaced by something simpler. A sense of being part of a larger movement, even without seeing the whole picture. Nothing needed to click into place tonight. Nothing needed to be resolved. Priya closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest inside the truth that had been there all along. She had never been missing. She had always been part of the whole. The hotel room was quiet in the particular way only hotel rooms are. Not truly silent, but padded. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a low, even sound that felt like it was holding the room together. Ava lay on the bed with one arm draped over her stomach, the other resting along her side, still in her work clothes shoes, kicked off near the door where they had landed. She had arrived less than an hour ago, but the sense of dislocation had already settled in. Different city, same carpet, same heavy curtains, same faint smell of detergent and recycled air. Ava had learned to recognize that feeling early in her career, the sense of being everywhere and nowhere at once. She was 29 and worked as a flight attendant. From the outside, it sounded glamorous. Travel, movement, a life that didn't sit still long enough to get boring. People often said they were jealous. Ava smiled when they did. It was easier than explaining the parts that didn't show up in photos. Tonight's flight had been smooth. Short conversations, polite passengers, nothing memorable. And yet, as soon as she closed the hotel door behind her, the quiet had pressed in heavier than expected. Ava rolled onto her side and stared at the thin strip of light leaking around the curtain. Somewhere beyond it, a city she barely knew was going about its evening. People meeting friends, people going home, people sleeping in beds that didn't change every few nights. She reached for the remote and turned the TV on, then off again almost immediately. The voices felt too close, too awake. She preferred the steady sound of the air conditioner, constant and indifferent. Ava pushed herself up and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on her thighs. She bent forward slightly, letting her head hang for a moment long enough to feel the blood shift, long enough for the day to slide out of focus. She'd been good at moving for as long as she could remember. Good at adapting, good at smiling, and being pleasant in short bursts. But nights like this always brought the same question quietly, without accusation. Where do I actually belong? Not in a dramatic way. She wasn't lonely exactly. She had friends. She had a job she liked well enough. But sometimes, especially in hotel rooms that all looked the same, she felt like a small point of light drifting between places, never landing long enough to be named. Ava stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out. The city below was a scatter of lights, uneven and distant. Cars moved along dark lines of road. A few buildings glowed brighter than others. No single light stood out for long. She leaned her forehead lightly against the glass and exhaled. Earlier that day, during a layover, she'd overheard a passenger talking about stars. About how some were so far away that the light reaching us now had started its journey millions of years ago. Some of those stars don't even exist anymore, the passenger had said casually. But we still see them. That idea had stayed with her. Ava looked at the lights below and thought about how often she felt small in comparison to everything else. How easy it was to believe that if she wasn't central, she must be insignificant. That if no one was looking directly at her, she might as well not be there at all. She pulled the curtain back into place and returned to the bed, sitting cross-legged, now hands resting loosely in her lap. The air conditioner clicked softly as it adjusted, then returned to its steady hum. Ava closed her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to pause. She noticed how her body felt when it wasn't bracing for the next announcement, the next boarding call, the next smile. There was a faint ache in her shoulders, a tiredness behind her eyes, and beneath that, something gentler, a quiet persistence. She thought about stars again, about how many of them we never notice. Not because they aren't shining, but because the sky is vast and our attention is limited. A star doesn't stop being a star just because it isn't named or pointed at. That thought didn't make her feel special. It made her feel allowed to be small without being meaningless, allowed to be quiet without disappearing. Ava lay back and stared at the ceiling. The room felt less foreign now, its edges softening as her breathing slowed. The air conditioner continued its steady work, filling the space with something predictable. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to anchor herself to one place to be real. She could exist exactly as she was moving, passing through, leaving small traces of light behind her without tracking where they landed. Some stars don't guide ships. Some don't carry names. They still shine. Ava felt her eyelids grow heavy as that idea settled in her body. Not as a belief to hold on to, but as a quiet truth she didn't need to defend. The room held her gently anonymous and safe as the night deepened around the window. Ava lay still as the room continued its quiet work around her. The air conditioner hummed without change, steady and unconcerned. Outside, the city lights shifted slightly as clouds moved through the sky, softening some points of brightness while allowing others to come through more clearly. She rested one hand on her stomach and felt the gentle rise and fall of her breath. Each inhale arrived on its own. Each exhale left without being held. Her body knew how to do this part without instruction. For a long time, Ava had believed that being visible meant being valuable. That if her presence didn't register strongly, if it didn't leave an impression, it must not have mattered. That belief had followed her from place to place, quietly shaping how she saw herself during layovers, conversations, even moments of rest. But stars don't measure their worth by how many eyes find them. They don't dim themselves when no one is looking. They don't rush to become brighter than the sky around them. The thought settled in her slowly, like light spreading after dusk. Ava didn't feel grand or important. She felt relieved, as if she had been released from a task she didn't remember agreeing to. She shifted slightly, pulling the blanket up and letting the weight of it ground her. The bed held her without preference. The room didn't ask for her story. It didn't need her to be interesting. Ava thought about the places she'd passed through over the years. Airports that blurred together. Hotel rooms she could barely distinguish from one another. Faces she remembered without names. All those moments had felt temporary, almost disposable, as if they didn't count because they didn't last. But nothing about a star's light is wasted. Even the faintest glow travels far beyond its origin, touching things it will never see. That idea softened something deep in her chest. Maybe her life didn't need a single fixed center to be meaningful. Maybe meaning could move with her, appearing wherever she was willing to be present, even briefly. She closed her eyes and let the darkness behind her eyelids deepen. The city outside continued without her participation. Cars moved, elevators rose and fell. Somewhere a door opened and closed. The room stayed steady. Ava noticed how much quieter her mind had become. The questions about belonging didn't feel urgent anymore. They could wait. They always could. She remembered standing at windows like this before in other cities, other nights, feeling the same smallness and mistaking it for emptiness. Tonight, that smallness felt different. It felt like space, not empty, open. The air conditioner clicked once, then resumed its hum. Ava's breathing matched it naturally, slow and even. The edges of her thoughts blurred, one dissolving into the next without resistance. She didn't need to shine in a particular way. She didn't need to be central. She didn't need to leave a mark she could track. Being here was enough. Shining quietly was enough. Some stars are seen, some are not. The sky makes room for all of them. Ava drifted toward sleep with that understanding resting gently in her body. The hotel room holding her like a temporary sky, neutral, quiet, and complete. Carla noticed the crack while she was washing dishes. It wasn't new. That was the strange part. The small ceramic bowl had been chipped for a long time, a thin line running from the rim down one side, like a quiet scar. She had used it dozens of times without really seeing it. Tonight, under the warm kitchen light, it caught her attention. She slowed her hands in the sink, letting the water run over the bowl. The crack darkened slightly as it filled, then lightened again as the water drained away. The sound of the faucet was steady, familiar, the kind of sound that made the rest of the house feel calmer. Carla was 48 and worked as a hairstylist. All day she stood behind people adjusting smoothing, making small corrections so others could leave feeling more put together than when they arrived. She was good at it. She had learned how to notice tiny details and fix them gently without drawing attention to the flaw. It rarely occurred to her to do the same for herself. She turned the bowl in her hands, studying the crack more closely now. It wasn't jagged. It didn't threaten to break apart. It simply existed, part of the bowl's shape, part of its history. Earlier that evening, a client had laughed and said, "You're so confident, I wish I was more like you." Carla had smiled and changed the subject the way she always did. Confidence felt like the wrong word. She felt capable, yes, reliable, but confident implied something unbroken, something smooth. Carla set the bowl in the drying rack and reached for a towel. As she dried her hands, her eyes drifted to the stack of mismatched dishes on the counter. None of them were perfect. Small chips, faded patterns, items collected over years rather than chosen all at once. She had always liked it that way. A kitchen that looked lived in. And yet, when it came to herself, she held a different standard. She noticed every crack, Every place where she felt she should have healed faster, known better, been stronger by now. The faucet clicked off. The kitchen settled into a deeper quiet, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock above the fridge. Carla leaned her hip against the counter and let her shoulders relax forward. She thought about the word flawed, how easily it attached itself to people. How often she had described herself that way in her own head, as if a crack automatically meant something was damaged beyond use. Carla picked the bowl up again and held it at eye level. The light caught the glaze unevenly along the crack, creating a faint line of reflection. It wasn't ugly. If anything, it made the bowl more interesting, more honest. She remembered something she had read years ago about old pottery in Japan. How cracks were sometimes repaired with gold, not to hide the break, but to highlight it. The idea had stayed with her, even if she couldn't remember the name for it. The bowl in her hands hadn't been repaired with gold. No one had tried to make the crack beautiful. And still, it held water. It held food. It did exactly what it was meant to do. Carla felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the kind that came when she thought about her own past. Relationships that hadn't lasted. Choices she replayed late at night, the quiet belief that if she were less marked, life would have gone more smoothly. She set the bowl back down carefully and rested both palms on the counter. The surface was cool, solid, trustworthy. She took a slow breath and let it out without shaping it. What if being whole didn't mean being uncracked? What if it simply meant being able to hold what life placed inside you? The thought didn't demand an answer. It stayed there like the bowl on the counter, waiting to be noticed. Carla turned off the kitchen light and left the room dim, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. The crack in the bowl was harder to see now, but she knew it was still there. And for the first time that evening, that didn't feel like a problem. Carla left the kitchen and moved into the living room, not turning on any more lights. The house felt different in the dimness, softer, less demanding. Shadows settled into corners without being asked to explain themselves. She sat down on the couch and let her back sink into the cushions, arms resting where they fell. The image of the bowl stayed with her, not as a symbol she needed to analyze, but as a quiet presence, something ordinary that had done its job without pretending to be untouched. She thought about how often she had treated her own life as if it were supposed to look unused. No visible wear, no chips, no signs that anything had ever pressed too hard. And when the marks showed up anyway, she'd taken them as evidence of failure instead of evidence of living. Carla crossed her legs and leaned her head back against the couch. The fabric was worn smooth in places, shaped by years of use. She liked that about it. It held her without trying to impress her. She remembered moments she usually avoided thinking about. Times she had trusted too much, stayed too long, left too early. None of them felt sharp tonight. They felt distant, like old weather that had already passed through. The bowl hadn't cracked because it was weak. It had cracked because it had been used, held heat, held weight, been part of countless small moments that mattered enough to leave a trace. Carla felt something ease in her chest as that understanding settled. She didn't need to repair herself to be acceptable. She didn't need to hide the places where life had pressed in. Those places didn't cancel her usefulness. They explained it. She stood up and walked back into the kitchen, drawn there without urgency. The bowl sat quietly in the drying rack, a thin line visible along its side. Carla lifted it again, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. It was steady, reliable. She filled it with water and carried it carefully to the sink. The bowl held the water without leaking, without protest. The crack didn't compromise its purpose. It simply told a story. Carla set the bowl down and turned off the remaining light. The kitchen faded into shadow, leaving only the faint outline of shapes she knew well. She didn't need to see everything clearly to trust it. In the bedroom, she changed into something soft and loose movements, slow, unhurried. The mirror caught her reflection briefly. She didn't look away. She didn't search for flaws. She just saw a woman who had been shaped by years of showing up. Carla lay down and pulled the blanket over herself, letting the weight settle across her shoulders. Her breathing slowed naturally, without direction. The day began to loosen its hold. She thought again of the pottery repaired with gold, the way cracks were honored instead of hidden. Not because suffering was beautiful, but because survival was honest. Maybe wholeness wasn't about returning to an unmarked state. Maybe it was about holding everything past present memory without falling apart. Carla felt her thoughts grow quieter, edges blurring. The crack no longer felt like something that needed attention. It simply existed, integrated, complete in its own way. The house rested around her, familiar and imperfect. The night moved forward without expectation. Somewhere the bowl waited in the kitchen, ready to be used again tomorrow. Carla closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest, without fixing, without correcting, without pretending to be unbroken. Nothing needed to be repaired tonight. Nothing needed to be hidden. She drifted toward sleep whole, not because she was flawless, but because she was still here, still holding still enough. The parking lot was still dark when Marcus turned the key. The engine came to life with a low, familiar sound, steady and unremarkable. He didn't pull out right away. He let the car sit there, headlights off, dashboard glowing softly in front of him. It was that hour before morning, fully decided to arrive, the sky not quite black, not quite blue. Marcus rested his forearms on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield. The road ahead was empty. No traffic, no rush. Just pavement stretching forward, waiting. He'd been awake for a while, not because he couldn't sleep, but because his body had learned this schedule too well. Years of early shifts had trained him to rise before the world did, to move before anyone asked. He liked that about himself. He liked being reliable. He liked being the one who showed up. But lately, something about that had started to feel heavy. Marcus was 41 now. A UPS driver. Strong hands, strong back. The kind of person people counted on without thinking much about it. When something needed to be carried, he carried it. When something needed to be done, he did it. And somewhere along the way, he'd begun to wait. Not consciously, not dramatically, just quietly. He waited for someone to notice, for someone to say, "You're doing enough," for someone to turn on a light and tell him he was headed in the right direction. The dashboard clock glowed faintly. He didn't check the time. He knew it by feel. Marcus reached to the side and picked up his thermos, taking a slow sip of coffee. It was still hot, bitter, grounding. He set it back in the cup holder and exhaled. Across the lot, one streetlight flickered, then steadied. The light didn't reach far, just enough to illuminate a small patch of asphalt beneath it. Everything else stayed in shadow. Marcus watched it for a moment longer than necessary. It reminded him of something his grandfather used to say when Marcus was a kid, whenever he complained about not knowing what to do next. "Don't wait for the sun," his grandfather would say. "Light your own lamp, just enough to see the next step." Back then, Marcus hadn't understood what that meant. He'd thought it was about confidence or bravery or being loud about what you wanted. Now, sitting alone in his truck before dawn, it felt different. Maybe it wasn't about becoming brighter. Maybe it was about becoming steadier. Marcus rested back against the seat. The fabric was worn, molded to his shape over years of use. This truck had seen a lot of his days: early mornings, long routes, quiet lunches eaten alone. It had never asked him to explain himself. He thought about how often he'd measured his worth by how much he could carry, how much responsibility he could shoulder without complaining, how little light he needed from others to keep going. But lately, the waiting had crept in. Waiting for validation, waiting for reassurance, waiting for some external signal that all this effort meant something. The streetlight flickered again, then held. Marcus realized that it didn't illuminate the whole lot. It didn't need to. It only lit what was directly beneath it. Enough to stand, enough to move. He turned the headlights on. The road ahead brightened instantly, the beam cutting through the dimness. Not the whole road, just the part right in front of him. Enough to drive, enough to trust. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. He didn't need the whole path lit up. He didn't need guarantees. He didn't need permission. He just needed enough light for the next mile. Marcus put the truck in gear and eased forward, tires rolling softly over the asphalt. As he drove toward the exit, the sky ahead lightened almost imperceptibly. Morning would come whether he waited or not, and for the first time in a while, he didn't feel like he was waiting for it. The road stayed quiet as Marcus drove, the tires humming steadily beneath him. Streetlights passed one by one, each illuminating a small circle of pavement before falling behind. None of them tried to light the whole way. They did their part, then let go. Marcus kept his hands loose on the wheel. His shoulders, usually braced for a long day ahead, had softened. The familiar route unfolded in front of him, turns he knew by heart, intersections he could navigate without thinking. The truck moved forward easily, as if it too understood that there was no need to rush. He thought about how long he'd been waiting for something to change. Not the job, not the schedule, but the feeling that his life would somehow feel more complete once someone else acknowledged it. Like the weight he carried would feel lighter once it was seen. But driving like this in the early quiet, he noticed something different. The light he needed was already there. It didn't come as praise or recognition. It came as the steady glow of knowing what to do next. Turn here. Slow down there. Keep moving. Marcus remembered all the small choices he made each day that no one applauded. Getting up early, finishing routes, helping a neighbor load a box, calling his sister back even when he was tired. None of it felt heroic. None of it needed to. It was enough to be consistent. The sky continued to brighten just slightly, not enough to erase the darkness completely. Marcus didn't watch it closely. He let it happen in the background. He didn't need to track progress to trust that it was happening. He took another sip of coffee. It had cooled a bit, but the taste was still familiar, comforting. He smiled faintly, thinking about how many mornings had started exactly like this. How many he'd rushed through half-present waiting for something else to arrive. This morning felt different, not because anything had changed, but because he wasn't asking it to. Marcus reached a long stretch of road with no lights at all. Just darkness beyond the headlights. The beam ahead held steady, revealing the lane lines and the edges of the road. Enough to keep going. He thought about his grandfather again, about the way he'd spoken without drama, as if what he was saying didn't need to be impressive to be true. Light your own lamp. It didn't mean doing everything alone. It didn't mean shutting people out. It meant not giving away the responsibility of your own sense of direction. It meant trusting that your inner sense of enough didn't have to be approved by anyone else. Marcus felt his breathing deepen naturally, matching the rhythm of the drive. In, out. The road flowed under him mile by mile. He wasn't thinking about the rest of the day anymore. He wasn't rehearsing conversations or counting stops. He was just here in motion, guided by a light that moved with him. The truck turned into another lot, then another street. The world was waking slowly now. A few cars appeared. A storefront sign flickered on. Ordinary life beginning again. Marcus parked briefly, shut off the engine, and sat in the quiet that followed. The sudden stillness felt complete, not empty. He rested his hands in his lap and closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't feel the need to ask whether this was enough. It was. The light had done its job. The path had revealed itself step by step. And Marcus, steady and unremarkable in the best way, continued on. The oil lamp didn't burn brighter than necessary. It simply stayed lit. And that was all it ever needed to do. Lila sat in her car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel long after the drive was over. The parking lot was quiet, washed in pale yellow light from a single lamp above. She could still smell the hospital on her clothes, cleaning solution latex, something faintly metallic. The smell lingered no matter how many times she told herself the shift was finished. She hadn't turned the radio on. She hadn't checked her phone. She just sat there breathing slowly, letting the silence press in around her. It had been a heavy day, not dramatic, not urgent, just heavy in the way hospice days often were. Quiet conversations, long pauses, a hand held a little longer than usual, a goodbye that didn't need words. Lila was good at this work. She knew how to be present without fixing, how to sit beside someone without filling the space. People often told her she had a calming presence, as if it were something she'd been born with. They didn't see the weight she carried afterward. She reached for the small towel she kept in the car and wiped her hands, even though they were already clean. It was a habit she'd developed over time. Not to remove dirt exactly, but to mark a transition. Work to home, holding to releasing. Still, some days, it didn't feel like enough. Lila leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes. Images from the day drifted through her mind, not sharply, but insistently. A quiet room, a shallow breath, a family member standing in the doorway, unsure where to put their grief. She felt tired in a way sleep didn't always touch. A thought surfaced, one she didn't like but knew well. Why does so much pain pass through me? Not as a complaint, more as a wondering, as if she were trying to understand the cost of caring. Outside the car, the night air had cooled. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler clicked on water, hissing softly against grass. The sound grounded her, pulling her attention outward for a moment. Lila opened her eyes and looked at her hands again. They were steady, capable, ordinary hands that had done extraordinary things simply by staying. She thought about something she'd learned early on, back when she first started volunteering. An older nurse had said it casually one afternoon while they stood washing their hands side by side. Nothing grows clean, she'd said. Not the good stuff. At the time, Lila hadn't known what to make of it. It sounded like one of those phrases people repeat without thinking. But over the years, the meaning had settled in. She pictured a lotus the way she'd once seen it in a book, blooming above dark water roots, buried deep in thick mud. The image wasn't pretty if you looked too closely at the bottom. But the flower itself wasn't diminished by where it came from. It was shaped by it. Lila exhaled slowly. The idea didn't erase the day. It didn't turn grief into something beautiful. It simply reframed it just enough to keep her from pushing it away. Maybe the mud wasn't a sign she was doing something wrong. Maybe it was the ground she was growing from. She sat there longer than usual, letting that thought rest without arguing with it. She didn't need to believe it fully. She just needed to let it exist alongside the tiredness. When she finally opened the car door, the cool air met her skin. She stepped out and stretched her shoulders, feeling the tightness release slightly. The night sky above was dark, cloudless. No stars visible from this lot. That was okay. Not every place needed to be beautiful. Lila walked toward her building keys, in hand, footsteps slow. With each step, the day felt a little less sticky. Not gone, just less attached. She knew tomorrow would bring more of the same. More quiet endings. More moments she couldn't fix. More weight. But she also knew something else now. Something she'd learned not from books, but from standing where she stood. What grew in her wasn't despite the mud. It was because of it. Inside her apartment, Lila moved slowly, as if the night itself had asked her not to rush. She set her keys down in the same small bowl by the door, hung her jacket on the hook, and slipped off her shoes. The familiar sounds of home settled around her, the soft click of the lamp turning on the distant hum of a refrigerator. The quiet steadiness of a place that asked nothing from her. She washed her hands again at the sink, letting the water run longer than necessary. Not to clean, but to feel. Warmth over skin. Movement without effort. She dried them carefully and noticed how her shoulders had dropped without her telling them to. Lila walked into the living room and sat on the couch, feet tucked beneath her. The cushion gave way gently. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle instead of resisting it. The images returned softer now. Faces, voices, silence. They didn't demand anything. They just passed through like clouds moving slowly across a night sky. She realized something she hadn't always understood when she was younger. That caring didn't mean carrying everything forever, that being open didn't require staying soaked. There was a difference between allowing something to touch you and letting it drown you. The lotus came to her mind again. Not as a picture this time, but as a feeling. The sense of something rising steadily without hurry through thick water. It didn't curse the mud. It didn't rush past it. It simply used it. Lila placed one hand on her chest and felt her breathing steady, quiet, alive. Her heart beat on, unconcerned with the stories she told herself about the day. It just kept going, faithful and patient. She thought about how often people praised strength without understanding what it was made of. How they admired calm without seeing the effort beneath it. How they loved the flower but forgot the soil. But the soil remembered. The mud held everything. The mess, the decay, the nutrients. Without it, there was nothing to rise from. Lila didn't feel lighter exactly. The weight was still there. But it had shifted, settling lower, no longer pressing against her chest. It felt like something she could rest on instead of something she had to fight. She stretched her legs out along the couch and adjusted the blanket over her lap. The fabric was soft, worn just enough to feel familiar. She let her head rest against the cushion and noticed how easily her body fit into the space. Tonight didn't need to be resolved. Nothing needed to be transformed. The work she did mattered not because it was clean or uplifting, but because it was real, because it met life where it actually was not where it wished it could be. Lila's breathing slowed further. Each inhale felt less deliberate, each exhale a little longer. The room grew quieter, or maybe she simply noticed it less. She thought about tomorrow, not with dread, not with planning, but with acceptance. Another day would come, more mud, more moments of quiet courage, more small acts that no one would see, and that was fine. The lotus didn't bloom all at once. It didn't hurry. It didn't apologize for where it grew. Lila let that image soften and fade, leaving only the sense of steady rising of something alive and intact beneath everything. Her eyes stayed closed. The room held her gently. The night did not ask her to be anything other than what she already was. Rooted, breathing, still growing. And for now, that was enough. The locker room smelled like metal and soap. Noah sat on the bench with his boots unlaced, elbows resting on his knees, helmet placed carefully on the floor in front of him. The room was mostly empty now. A few lockers stood open, their doors swinging slightly before settling back into stillness. Somewhere down the hall, a shower ran water hitting tile in a steady rhythm. Noah rubbed a towel across the back of his neck and let out a slow breath. It hadn't been a bad call. No one was hurt. No fire had spread. Everything had gone the way it was supposed to. And yet his body felt worn in that familiar way, like something inside him had been scraped a little thinner. He picked up his helmet and turned it in his hands. The surface was scuffed, dulled from years of use. A few scratches caught the light. None of them new, none of them dramatic, just the quiet evidence of repetition. People often talked about his job like it was all adrenaline and heroics, but most days it wasn't like that. Most days were about patience, about waiting, about being ready for something that might not happen. And when it did happen, about staying steady under pressure. That steadiness came at a cost. Noah slid the helmet back into his locker and closed the door. The metal clanged softly final. He leaned back against the bench and stared at the floor, letting his breathing slow. Lately, he'd been feeling the weight of it more than usual. Not fear, not doubt about his ability, something quieter. The sense that each challenge left a mark even when things went well. That each test, each difficult moment was sanding something down inside him. He wondered sometimes if all this friction was slowly wearing him away. An older firefighter had once said something to him during a long night shift years ago. They'd been sitting on the back step of the station drinking burnt coffee, watching the sky lighten just enough to signal morning. "You know what they do with jade?" the man had said out of nowhere. "They don't cut it clean. They grind it. Over and over. Takes forever." Noah hadn't known what to say at the time. He'd nodded, half listening, half exhausted. Now the memory surfaced again, unexpectedly clear. Jade didn't start out smooth. It wasn't impressive at first glance. It was dense, rough, hard to shape. And the only way it became something people valued was through repeated polishing, through friction. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily over time. Noah flexed his hands, noticing the faint soreness in his fingers. These hands had learned how to hold steady when things shook, how to grip, release, adjust. They bore small scars he rarely thought about anymore. He'd always assumed that being tested meant something was wrong. That struggle was a sign of weakness. That if things were truly aligned, they would feel easier. But the jade didn't become dull because it was polished. It became clear. Noah stood and stretched his arms overhead, feeling the tightness along his shoulders release a little. The room seemed quieter now, the earlier energy fully drained away. He thought about the moments that had shaped him the most. They weren't the ones where everything went perfectly. They were the moments that had demanded something from him. Patience, restraint, courage, humility. Moments that had forced him to slow down and stay present. Each one had felt uncomfortable at the time. Each one had left him changed. He picked up his jacket and slipped it on the familiar weight settling around him. It felt grounding, like a reminder of who he was when things got hard. The locker room lights flickered briefly, then steadied. Noah turned toward the door, pausing for a second before leaving. Maybe he wasn't being worn down. Maybe he was being refined. The thought didn't erase the fatigue. It didn't make the work lighter, but it gave the weight a different shape, one he could carry without resentment. Noah reached for the door handle and stepped out into the quiet hallway. The night beyond waited calmly, indifferent to what he'd just been through. And for the first time that evening, he felt less like something was being taken from him, and more like something was being revealed. The hallway outside the locker room felt cooler, quieter. Noah's footsteps echoed softly as he walked toward the exit, the sound fading almost as soon as it appeared. The building had settled for the night. Whatever urgency had filled it earlier was gone now, replaced by a steady calm that didn't need explanation. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of asphalt and damp grass. A few stars were visible above the station, dim but present. Noah paused, hands in his jacket pockets, and let the night meet him where he was. His body still felt tired. That hadn't changed, but the tiredness no longer felt like something he needed to fight. It felt earned, honest, like a signal that he had stayed present when it mattered. He thought again about the Jade, about how polishing wasn't about force. It was about consistency. Pressure applied slowly, carefully, with attention. Too much and the stone cracked. Too little and nothing changed. The process demanded patience more than strength. That felt familiar. Noah had learned over the years how to stay with difficult moments without rushing past them. How to respond instead of react. How to trust his training when instinct wanted to take over. None of that showed up as brilliance from the outside. It showed up as quiet reliability. And that reliability had been shaped, not gifted. He walked toward his car and unlocked it, the sound of the door opening small and final in the quiet lot. Before getting in, he leaned against the side of the vehicle, feeling the cool metal through his jacket. He remembered times when he'd wished things were easier, when he'd wondered why certain challenges kept returning slightly different, but familiar enough to recognize. He'd thought he was failing to move past something. Now the pattern looked different. The repetition wasn't punishment. It was practice. Each time he stayed steady, something inside him smoothed out just a little more. Each time he chose patience over force, clarity over impulse, he became more himself, not less. Noah sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. The interior light clicked on briefly, then went dark. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and took a slow breath in, then out. The mind liked to tell stories about struggle, that it meant damage, that it meant loss. But the body often knew better. The body understood adaptation. It understood how friction could strengthen instead of weaken. He started the car and let it idle, not in a hurry to leave. The engine's low vibration traveled up through the seat, grounding him. Noah didn't feel proud. He didn't feel accomplished. What he felt was something quieter and more stable, a sense of trust. Trust that what he was going through was shaping him in ways he couldn't fully see yet. The jade didn't shine while it was being polished. It didn't announce its progress. It simply endured the process, slowly becoming clear. Noah pulled out of the lot and onto the road. The station disappeared behind him, lights dimming in the rearview mirror. The route home was familiar. He didn't need directions. As he drove, the tension in his shoulders eased. His thoughts loosened their grip. The day began to recede, leaving behind only what was necessary. He wasn't broken. He wasn't behind. He was becoming. The road stretched ahead, dark and open. Noah followed it, calmly illuminated, just enough to keep moving. Whatever came next would bring its own friction. He knew that, but now it felt less like something to fear and more like part of the shaping. The jade would continue to be polished, and in its own time, it would shine. They didn't remember when it started, not the moment exactly. Just the feeling of slowly adjusting themselves to fit. Lowering their voice in certain rooms, choosing words carefully, smiling at the right time, holding opinions loosely even when they felt strong inside. It wasn't a lie, it was adaptation. And for a long time, it felt like maturity. That evening, they were walking through their neighborhood as the light faded. Street lamps flickered on, one by one, casting soft pools of yellow on the sidewalk. Leaves crunched underfoot. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then went quiet again. They walked without headphones, hands tucked into their jacket pockets, letting the night sound be enough. The day had been full of small compromises, nothing dramatic, no conflict worth naming, just moments where they felt themselves hesitate before speaking, where they checked the room before responding, where they adjusted not because they were afraid, but because it felt easier. Easier to be agreeable, easier to be flexible, easier to be liked. By the time they got home, they often felt strangely tired, even on days when they hadn't done much. The exhaustion didn't come from effort. It came from restraint, from holding parts of themselves back without noticing. As they walked, they passed a small park tucked between two streets. The lights were dimmer there, shadows stretching across the grass. A bird stirred in a tree, wings fluttering briefly before settling again. The sound caught their attention. It was soft, quick, instinctive. They stopped for a moment and looked up, though they couldn't see much through the branches. Just movement. Just the sense of something alive and alert responding to the night without hesitation. It made something tighten in their chest. They remembered a time when they moved like that. Not recklessly, just honestly. When choices came from a clear internal yes or no instead of a calculation. Somewhere along the way, they had learned to check themselves first. Will this make things awkward? Is this too much? Should I hold back a little? Those questions had become second nature. Protective, sensible, but also heavy. They resumed walking, steps slow and even. The rhythm of their movement matched their breathing, steady and calm. The street ahead curved, slightly disappearing behind a row of houses. They thought about how often freedom is misunderstood. People imagine it as escape, as leaving everything behind, as doing whatever you want without consequence. That kind of freedom had never appealed to them. What they missed was quieter. The freedom to respond without rehearsing. The freedom to say no without guilt. The freedom to say yes without explaining. The freedom to be aligned. They reached a corner where the sidewalk widened. A bench sat under a tree empty. They paused there, resting one foot on the curb, feeling the cool air move across their face. The truth was, they weren't trapped by anyone else. No one had asked them to disappear. No one had demanded they shrink. They had done it themselves, slowly, out of habit. Out of a desire to keep things smooth. Out of care. Care can be a beautiful thing. But when it's not balanced, it can turn into a cage. They leaned against the tree and closed their eyes briefly. The bark was rough against their shoulder, solid, real. A thought surfaced not as a challenge, but as a gentle curiosity. What if being myself is enough, even when it's inconvenient? The idea didn't feel rebellious. It felt relieving. They opened their eyes and noticed how quiet the park was now. The bird had gone still again. The street lamps hummed faintly. The night didn't demand performance. They took a deeper breath than before, chest expanding fully, then let it go without controlling the exhale. The body responded immediately, shoulders lowering just a fraction. It wasn't freedom as a grand declaration. It was freedom as a release. They pushed off the tree and continued walking, posture a little looser. Now steps a little less careful. Nothing visible had changed. Anyone watching would see the same person walking home. But inside, something had stretched its wings, not to fly away, just to breathe. They didn't suddenly change who they were. They didn't start speaking louder or saying everything that came to mind. They didn't make bold declarations or redraw the shape of their life overnight. What changed was smaller than that. As they walked the rest of the way home, they noticed how often they'd been holding their breath without realizing it. In conversations, in decisions, in moments where they waited for permission that never actually came. They let their breath move freely now, in and out, matching the pace of their steps. The body responded right away, as if it had been waiting for that signal. At the next intersection, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the sidewalk. For a second, their shadow stretched long in front of them, then fell back into place behind. The image lingered. They had spent so much time trying to stay within certain outlines, certain expectations, certain versions of who they should be, depending on the room they were in. But shadows change with the light. They don't mean something is wrong. They just mean you're still here. They reached their front door and paused before going inside. The house was dark, quiet, familiar. A place where they didn't need to perform. Or at least where they were learning not to. Inside, they set their keys down and leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface under their palms. The day loosened its hold a little more. They thought about how often they'd mistaken safety for freedom. Safety had meant staying agreeable, staying predictable, staying small enough not to disrupt the balance. It had worked in a way. It had kept things smooth. But it had also kept them separate from themselves. Freedom, they were realizing, wasn't about pushing against anyone. It wasn't about rejecting connection or choosing solitude over belonging. It was about alignment. About letting the inside and the outside match, even when that felt slightly uncomfortable. even when it meant allowing a pause instead of filling the space, allowing a no instead of another yes. They sat down on the couch and rested their head back, eyes closing for a moment. The quiet wrapped around them, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's TV through the wall. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. They placed a hand on their chest and felt the steady beat beneath it. That rhythm hadn't changed based on anyone else's approval. It hadn't sped up to impress. It hadn't slowed down to fit in. It just kept going. There was a kind of happiness in that realization. Not the bright celebratory kind, but the steady kind. The kind that comes from no longer fighting yourself. They didn't need to be everyone's version of easy. They didn't need to be endlessly adaptable. They didn't need to earn the right to take up space. Being themselves didn't mean being rigid or selfish. It meant being honest, responsive, alive in their own skin. Tomorrow there would be moments when they slipped back into old habits, when they softened their edges out of reflex, when they forgot. That didn't mean the wings were gone. It just meant they were still learning how to use them. They lay back and let the night settle, fully breathing slow and even. Somewhere outside, something moved in the dark, unseen, unjudged, simply following its nature. They didn't need to fly away to be free. They only needed to stop folding themselves smaller than they were. And in that quiet decision made again and again in small moments, happiness found room to land. The park was almost empty. Just a narrow path, a few benches, and a small stream running quietly alongside the trees. It wasn't the kind of place people posted about. No wide views, no dramatic scenery, just water moving over stones, steady and unremarkable. They stopped near the edge of the stream and stood there with their hands in their pockets. The air was cool, not cold. The kind that makes you aware of your breathing without asking you to change it. Earlier that day, they'd felt small. Not in a dramatic way. No one had said anything cruel. No big mistake had happened. It was more subtle than that. A conversation where someone talked about their plans with confidence. A comparison they hadn't meant to make. A quiet sense of falling behind without knowing exactly where. I'm not doing enough. I should be further along. This feels insignificant. The thoughts had followed them all afternoon, light but persistent like background noise. They watched the water move. It didn't rush. It didn't hesitate. It didn't try to widen itself into something more impressive. It just flowed, finding its way around rocks, slipping through narrow spaces, pooling briefly before continuing on. The sound was soft. A constant, gentle rush broken occasionally by a splash when the water met a stone at the wrong angle. Nothing about it demanded attention, and yet it didn't stop. They leaned forward, slightly resting their hands on their knees, watching how the stream curved. In some places, it narrowed to almost nothing. In others, it spread out just enough to catch the light. They had always admired rivers, the way they carved paths through landscapes, the way they arrived at the ocean eventually, no matter how long it took. This wasn't that. This was just a small stream, and for a long time they had believed that small meant incomplete, that unless you were making a visible impact, unless your progress was obvious and measurable, you weren't really moving at all. That growth had to look like expansion, like speed, like recognition. Standing here, though, that belief felt less solid. The stream wasn't pretending to be a river. It wasn't apologizing for its size. It wasn't waiting for permission to continue. It moved because movement was what it did. They picked up a small pebble and rolled it between their fingers. Smooth, worn down by time and water. The kind of stone you don't notice unless you're looking closely. How long had it taken to get this smooth? Not days, not weeks, years, maybe longer. The stream hadn't rushed it, hadn't forced it. It had just kept showing up day after day, doing the same quiet work. They thought about their own path, the slow progress, the starts that didn't lead anywhere obvious, the steady effort that never seemed to add up to something impressive. They had spent so much energy wishing they were a river wide, fast, undeniable, that they hadn't noticed they were already moving. They dropped the pebble back into the water and watched it disappear, swallowed instantly by the current. The stream didn't change course. It didn't react. It just carried on. A thought surfaced, simple and unexpected. What if getting there doesn't require being big? The idea didn't come with relief right away. It felt almost disappointing at first, like lowering expectations, like admitting defeat. But as they stayed with it, the thought softened. Maybe arriving isn't about scale. Maybe it's about continuity. The stream didn't know where the ocean was. It wasn't aiming for anything. It wasn't measuring distance or tracking milestones. It was just moving in the only way it could. They straightened up and took a slow breath. The sound of the water filled the space around them, steady and reliable. They realized how often they'd been waiting to feel ready before allowing themselves to count their efforts, waiting for proof that what they were doing mattered, waiting for someone to confirm that this pace was acceptable. But the stream didn't wait. It trusted the shape of the land. It trusted gravity. It trusted time. And somehow, that was enough. The sky above the trees had begun to dim, the light shifting toward evening. Shadows stretched across the path. The park grew quieter still. They stood there a few minutes longer, letting the sound of the water settle into them. They didn't suddenly feel successful. They didn't feel accomplished. But they felt less rushed, less tempted to dismiss what was already happening. They turned away from the stream and started back down the path, steps slow and even. The sound of the water followed them for a while, then faded as the trees thickened. Still, the rhythm stayed, a reminder that movement doesn't have to be loud to be real. They kept walking, but more slowly now. The path curved away from the stream, and the sound of water softened with each step. At first, it was still clear, a steady presence just behind them. Then it became distant, then barely noticeable, and finally it blended into the rest of the evening. They were surprised by how much they missed it. Not because it was beautiful or impressive, but because it had been constant, reliable, It hadn't tried to hold their attention. It had simply been there doing its quiet work. They thought about how often they judged their own life by volume. How loud is this success? How visible is this progress? How many people can see what I'm doing? Anything quieter than that felt easy to dismiss. They reached a bench near the edge of the path and sat down, resting their elbows on their knees. The wood was cool and slightly rough under their hands. Somewhere above them, branches shifted as the wind moved through leaves, brushing against one another in a soft, uneven rhythm. The truth was, they had been moving all along, even on the days that felt stagnant, even in the seasons that felt repetitive, even when no one noticed. They had learned things, shed habits, changed direction in small, almost invisible ways. The kind that didn't make good announcements, but made a real difference over time. Like water shaping stone without asking permission. They remembered moments they used to label as wasted. Jobs that didn't lead anywhere obvious. Relationships that ended quietly. Periods where nothing seemed to change at all. Looking back now, those moments felt different. They weren't dead ends. They were bends in the path. Places where the current slowed, widened, learned how to move around something instead of through it. They realized how much pressure they'd been carrying to become something bigger, faster, more defined. As if worth increased with size, as if being noticeable was the same as being meaningful. But the stream hadn't needed to announce itself to matter. It didn't need to be named on a map. It didn't need an audience. It didn't need to know where it was going next. It just kept going. They rested their hands on their thighs and let their shoulders relax. The body followed the thought naturally, like it recognized something true. There was a deep comfort in letting go of the idea that they had to become more than they were. What if becoming wasn't about expansion, but about continuation, about showing up again tomorrow, and the day after that, about letting effort compound quietly instead of demanding immediate results? They sat there for a while longer, watching the light fade through the trees. The park felt held in a kind of in-between state, not fully day, not fully night. The air cooled just enough to be refreshing. Eventually, they stood and brushed their hands together, leaving faint traces of dust behind. They didn't feel inspired in the dramatic sense. They didn't feel driven. They felt steady. As they walked back toward the exit, the idea stayed with them. They didn't need to widen themselves to justify their existence. They didn't need to rush to prove they were going somewhere. They didn't need to compare their pace to anyone else's current. The stream would reach the ocean one day. Not because it tried harder, not because it grew larger, but because it never stopped moving. And that they realized was something they could trust too. They stepped out of the park and back onto the street, the sounds of the neighborhood returning slowly. Cars in the distance, a door closing somewhere, ordinary life continuing. Inside them, the rhythm remained. Quiet, persistent, enough. They noticed it while walking along the water. Not the scenery, not the light, just the feeling under their feet, the uneven ground. small stones shifting slightly with each step, never quite settling where you expect them to. The path followed the edge of a quiet pond, the kind tucked behind apartment buildings or office parks. Nothing dramatic, no signs pointing it out. Just water trees and a thin strip of land people used when they wanted to think without being interrupted. They walked slowly, hands loose at their sides, letting the rhythm of their steps match the sounds around them. Water lapped gently against the bank. Somewhere nearby, a bird moved through the brush, then went still again. It had been a long few years. Not long in the way that comes with constant crisis, but long in the way that comes with pressure that never quite lifts. Responsibilities stacking, expectations accumulating. Moments where they told themselves to push through just a little longer. They had learned how to be tough. Not loud tough, quiet tough. The kind that doesn't complain, the kind that absorbs impact and keeps going. The kind that people admire without realizing what it costs. At first, that strength felt like armor. It protected them, helped them survive, gave them something solid to lean on when things felt uncertain. But over time, the armor hardened. They found themselves reacting faster, less patient, less flexible. Certain things rubbed them the wrong way more easily than before. Small frustrations lingered longer than they used to. They hadn't become bitter. They had become rigid. They stopped near the water and crouched down, resting their forearms on their knees. The surface of the pond reflected the sky in broken pieces, rippling with every small movement. Along the edge, stones of all shapes and sizes lined the bank. One caught their eye, a small pebble, light gray, smooth to the touch. No sharp edges, no corners. It fit easily in the palm of their hand. They picked it up and turned it over slowly. This stone hadn't always been like this. Once it had edges, angles, resistance. It had been part of something larger, something solid. Over time, water had met it again and again, wearing it down, not through force, but through consistency. The pebble didn't look damaged, it looked complete. They thought about how often they had judged themselves for feeling worn, for not having the same sharpness they once did, for being slower to react, for needing more rest than before. They'd told themselves they were losing something. But holding the pebble now, they wondered if that was true. What if what I'm losing is what no longer serves me? They rolled the pebble between their fingers. It felt grounding, familiar, like something they had known for a long time without being able to name. Life had sanded them down, not gently, not all at once, but steadily, through disappointment, through repetition, through showing up on days when they didn't feel inspired or strong. Each moment had left its mark, not as damage, as shaping. They had learned when to bend instead of break, when to let things pass instead of pushing back, when to stay still and when to move away. Those weren't losses. They were skills. They dropped the pebble back onto the bank and watched it settle among the others, indistinguishable at first glance, yet entirely itself. The pond continued its quiet movement. The water didn't judge the stones, didn't favor the sharp ones or the smooth ones. It touched them all the same again and again, shaping without intention. They stood and brushed their hands together, feeling the grit fall away. Their body felt heavier than it used to, but also more grounded, less reactive, more present. They had been through a lot. That didn't make them broken. It made them shaped. They took one last look at the water before continuing down the path. The sound followed them for a while, steady and soft, like a reminder that change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply leaves you smoother than before. They continued along the path, the pond staying beside them like a quiet companion. The water reflected less sky now, more shadow, as evening settled in. The world felt slower, as if everything had agreed to lower its voice at the same time. With each step, they became more aware of their body. The slight stiffness in the knees, the way their shoulders naturally rounded forward when they were tired. These weren't signs of weakness anymore. They were signals. Information earned through time. Once they would have ignored them. Once they would have pushed through, proud of their ability to endure. Proud of being the one who didn't need breaks, didn't ask for help, didn't show where. That pride had served them. It had carried them through difficult years, but it had also taught them to resist softness. They remembered a version of themselves from long ago, quick to react sharp in conversation, certain in their opinions. That person had felt powerful, unmovable, like a rock that nothing could touch. But rocks that never change eventually crack. The pebble by the water hadn't cracked. It had changed shape. They slowed and rested one hand against the railing near the path, feeling the cool metal under their palm. The contact was grounding, real. A reminder that support doesn't have to be dramatic to be effective. They thought about the times life had worn them down in ways they hadn't chosen. Losses that reshaped priorities, responsibilities that narrowed choices, repeated disappointments that softened expectations. Each one had felt like erosion, but erosion hadn't taken everything. It had taken what couldn't last. It had smoothed the sharp reactions, rounded the rigid beliefs, quieted the need to always be right. What remained felt steadier. They realized that being smooth didn't mean being empty. It meant being able to move without cutting themselves on their own edges. It meant fitting into places they once resisted. It meant being touched by life without being damaged by it. They stopped again and looked out across the pond. The surface was calm now, only faint ripples marking where something had passed through. They didn't need to go back to who they were before. That version had done its work. The person they were now carried more patience, more tolerance for uncertainty, a deeper understanding of what mattered and what didn't. Those qualities hadn't come from avoiding hardship. They had come from being shaped by it. They took a slow breath and let it out fully, feeling the tension leave their chest in small increments. The night air felt cooler against their skin, refreshing rather than biting. They started walking again, steps steady, unhurried. They no longer felt the need to defend themselves against the world. They didn't need to be as sharp as they once were to feel safe. They trusted their ability to adapt, to respond, to endure without hardening. Like the pebble, they had learned how to stay whole while changing. And as the path curved away from the water, they carried that knowledge with them, not as a lesson, not as a victory, just as a quiet truth. They hadn't been worn down. They had been shaped into something that could last. Carla has always thought of herself as someone who knows how to care, caring at the right moment, checking in just enough, remembering small details that others tend to forget. With her client's hair, she does the same, watching closely, sensing moods, adjusting her tone so people feel looked after. Caring is how she shows love. But on some nights when everything is finally quiet, Carla feels a very specific kind of tired. Tired from caring too much. And deeper than that, tired from the fear that if she stops caring, everything will dry up. Carla is 48, a hairstylist at a small neighborhood salon. That day has been long. Many clients, many stories, many emotions that people leave behind without realizing it. When she gets home, she changes clothes, washes her face, then steps out into the backyard almost automatically. The yard isn't big, just a small space with a few potted plants, a row of basil, a small flowering bush by the fence. String lights on the porch cast a warm glow, softening everything. She picks up the garden hose. Water bursts out with a light hiss, then settles into a steady stream. Carla turns it toward the nearest pot, watering thoroughly, as if the plant has been waiting for her all day. The soil darkens, the smell of damp earth rises. She keeps watering longer than necessary, even though the soil already shines with moisture. In her mind, a conversation is being watered the same way. A text from her daughter earlier that afternoon, just 2 words, "Okay, Mom." Carla has read it again and again. What kind of okay is that? Is she upset? Tired? Is something wrong? She's not saying. Carla has typed a longer message, deleted it. Typed another, deleted that too. She tells herself she's just being caring. But the feeling in her chest doesn't feel like care. It feels like worry. Like the need to control. Like the fear of being left out. Carla moves to the second pot. A small plant she only planted a few weeks ago. The leaves are still thin and new. She waters more gently, but still too much. Water begins to spill over the edge of the pot, running across the concrete in thin lines. She pauses, watching the water flow away, and suddenly notices something simple: the soil is soaked. The plant doesn't need more water. It needs air. Space in the soil so the roots can breathe. She stands still. The water keeps running. Her hand hasn't turned the hose off yet. Carla lowers the flow, then shuts it off completely. The quiet that follows is surprisingly loud. Like turning off a machine that's been running all day and suddenly hearing the house breathe. Carla looks down at the pot. The soil is saturated. Droplets cling to the surface. She remembers something a client once said about love. "I cared so much, I made them feel suffocated." At the time, Carla nodded like it was someone else's story. Tonight, the words return and rest gently on her chest. Some relationships are like plants. They need care. But if you water them every day, watering to be sure, watering because you're afraid they'll die, the roots lose their space to breathe. Not because the other person doesn't need love, but because love mixed with anxiety turns into pressure. Carla leans the hose against the wall and sits down on the back steps. The string lights cast a warm glow across her knees. The night air is cool. She hears distant cars, insects, and the sound of her own heart beating a little fast with a familiar restlessness. What if I don't text again? What if I don't ask more questions? What if I leave things alone and they drift away? She looks at the phone resting on the small table by the door. The screen is dark. No notifications. Carla feels the urge to pick it up to check to send one more message just to be sure. And in that moment she sees it clearly. This is a habit. A habit born from love, but fed by anxiety. Carla doesn't judge herself. She's lived this way for years. With clients, with family, with friends. She's used to keeping connection by doing more. But tonight, sitting in front of pots heavy with water, she realizes something very simple. Sometimes loving isn't about adding more. It's about doing less. Less checking. Less intervening. Less watering something that's asking for space. She places a hand on her chest, reminding her body that she's still here. Not abandoned just because she hasn't sent another message. She inhales, then exhales. That exhale lasts a little longer, as if she's experimenting with doing nothing. If you're listening and there's someone in your life you keep wanting to water with worry, texting more, asking more, imagining more, that's okay. You're not wrong for caring. You're just using too much water on roots that need air. Carla looks back at the small plant. Its leaves are still green. Nothing has died just because she turned off the hose, and maybe a relationship is the same way. Carla stays seated on the back step a little longer. Not because she's waiting for something to happen, but because there's no reason to stand up right away. After turning off the hose, the space around her becomes noticeably quieter. Not quiet from a lack of sound, but quiet because nothing is being interfered with anymore. The night breeze moves through the yard, so light it only makes the string lights sway slightly. Carla draws her shoulders in a bit, feeling the cool air on her skin. In that pause, she notices something small but clear. Her heart is beating more slowly, not suddenly, not in a forced, relaxed way, just no longer driven by the question, should I do something else? She looks toward the pots. Water still pools on the surface of the soil, reflecting the lights in tiny points. She knows that by morning, the soil will be less wet. The roots will have space to breathe again. She doesn't need to stand guard. She doesn't need to adjust anything. Nature knows how to do its work when it's left alone. Carla thinks of her daughter. Not to analyze the text message, just the face, the voice, the way she shrugs slightly when she says, "Okay, Mom." Something softens in Carla as she realizes this. Her love doesn't disappear just because she doesn't send another message tonight. It's still there. It's just no longer being watered with anxiety. The phone remains on the small table. The screen stays dark. Carla doesn't touch it. Not because she's forcing herself to let go, but because the urge simply isn't there. And in that not doing, a small trust begins to take root. Relationships don't need to be held together with tension. She stands and walks over to the small plant, bends down to look. One young leaf droops slightly from too much water. She doesn't touch it, doesn't fix it, just looks. Then she smiles very gently, the smile of someone who's realized she doesn't have to do anything more for things to live. Carla steps back inside and pulls the door closed, not locking it, just closing it to keep the warmth in. The living room light is soft. She moves slowly as if her body is relearning a pace without urgency. Each step carries no question that needs answering. When she lies down in bed, Carla pulls the blanket up to her shoulders. The fabric is soft. She places one hand on her belly, the other resting naturally at her side. Her breath moves in and out, no longer caught in her chest the way it was before. She doesn't try to lengthen it. She just lets it happen. A thought passes through tomorrow. I can check in again. Then it fades. Not because she pushes it away, but because it doesn't need to be decided tonight. Some decisions don't need to be watered in the dark. If you're listening and you recognize this habit of loving by worrying more than necessary tonight, you might try something very small. Do nothing extra. Don't send another message. Don't think one more thought. Just give the roots of everything some space. Love doesn't disappear when you pause. It changes shape. From tight to soft, from control to trust, from fear of loss to permission. Carla exhales a little longer than usual. Her shoulders sink into the mattress. Her body understands something now. She doesn't have to keep every relationship alive by force. Some parts belong to nature, and nature, when trusted, usually does its work well. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's perfectly fine. You're not missing anything. Everything important is still growing even while you rest. And if you're still awake, there's no need to push sleep to arrive. Just lie still, let the breath keep doing its work, and allow this night to remain unwatered. Listen for a little while, and then let everything grow on its own. Sometimes exhaustion doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from repeating the same familiar motion over and over, without realizing you're not actually going anywhere. Kevin knows that feeling. It's like watching a hamster in a small cage, running fast, completely focused, the wheels spinning hard, while the cage itself stays exactly where it is. Kevin is 37, an accountant. This time of year is busy. The kind of busy where days and nights blur together without clear edges. That evening, the office is almost empty. The fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. The air conditioning blows steadily colder than necessary. On his desk, a spreadsheet glows on the screen, long rows of numbers lined up neatly, as if they've never known what it means to be tired. Kevin takes a sip of cold coffee. The bitter taste makes him wince slightly. He sets the cup down and looks back at the screen. His fingers move quickly, switching tabs, dragging the mouse, scanning. One number, then another. No major errors, no problems. And still he keeps checking, as if running faster might take him somewhere else. In his head, everything is running too. The to-do list. The tasks already finished, but still needing another review. The tasks not yet done, but already imagined ahead of time. He knows this feeling well. If he stops, something will be missed. If he stops, the wheel will stop spinning, and that would mean it isn't safe. Kevin shifts in his chair, leaning back, then forward again. The chair makes a small sound. He doesn't notice. He's used to his body speaking while his mind doesn't listen. In the corner of the room, the printer gives a soft beep and then goes quiet. There's no one there to print anything else. He suddenly realizes he's doing the same check for the third time. Not because the data has changed, just because the feeling inside him hasn't settled yet. Like the hamster that keeps running, not because there's a path, but because it doesn't know how to stand still inside the wheel. Kevin lifts a hand to his forehead. His skin feels tight. His eyes ache. But what exhausts him most isn't the number of hours worked. It's the sense of not getting anywhere. The feeling that no matter how fast he runs tomorrow, will just begin with another wheel. There's a very small moment when he stops moving the mouse. The cursor freezes. The numbers don't shift. And in that moment, nothing collapses. No alarms, no urgent emails, just the hum of the air conditioner and the steady light above. Kevin notices he's been holding his breath, not completely, just tight in the chest, like he's bracing for the next sprint. He exhales, not deeply, just enough to notice how many times he's been breathing in without ever paying attention. He looks at the spreadsheet one more time, then closes it, not because the work is finished, but because this round of running is enough for tonight. The screen shifts to the quieter desktop. The blue light softens. In his chest, a small space opens up, unfamiliar, but not frightening. Kevin stands and walks a few steps around his desk. The office carpet muffles his footsteps. He looks out the window. The city lights are still there, glowing in the night, but nothing is asking him to join in. Not every wheel needs you to run inside it. There's a truth Kevin has never really named before. Constant motion creates the feeling of control. Stopping doesn't. And that's why stopping can feel unsettling. But tonight in the empty office, he realizes something very simple. He isn't tied to this wheel. It only keeps spinning because he keeps running. He returns to his desk, gathers a few papers, and turns off the desk lamp. The room grows dimmer, softer. Kevin doesn't feel done, but he feels enough for now. If you're listening and you recognize this feeling of running endlessly in your own mind from one thought to the next, that's okay. You're not lazy. You're not failing. You're just inside a wheel that's been spinning for too long. And sometimes the only thing needed is to step out of it. Not forever, just for tonight. Kevin stands still in the office for a little while longer after turning off his desk lamp. Not because he's debating whether to keep working, but because his body is getting used to not having to lunge forward. When a movement has been repeated long enough, stopping can feel a little unsteady, like stepping onto solid ground after getting off an escalator. He puts on his jacket, turns off the monitor, then reaches up and switches off the ceiling lights. The room sinks into the dim glow from the hallway. The air conditioner keeps humming, but Now it sounds farther away, like a noise that no longer needs attention. Kevin locks the door. The soft click of the lock is small, but enough to mark the end of a running cycle. The office hallway is empty. The carpet absorbs sound, softening everything. Kevin walks slowly, not because he's exhausted, but because there's no reason to rush anymore. When he reaches the parking lot, the air feels cooler. He inhales, then exhales, this time more fully. Not as an exercise, just because the breath finally has room to go somewhere. Inside the car, Kevin sits for a moment before starting the engine. His hands rest on the steering wheel. The dashboard is still dark. There's a strange but pleasant feeling, no to-do list right now. No spreadsheets, no wheel. He starts the car and drives out slowly. Streetlights form a chain of glowing circles ahead of him. Kevin doesn't turn on music, not because he wants silence, but because silence is already there. Each circle of light passes like a breath. No counting. No need to arrive sooner. A thought flickers. What about tomorrow? It appears then isn't fed. Kevin doesn't push it away. He just doesn't run after it. And without anyone driving the wheel, it slows on its own. When he gets home, Kevin takes off his shoes and sets his keys on the table. The apartment is quiet. The living room light is soft. He goes straight to the kitchen and pours a glass of water. Drinks slowly. The coolness moving down his throat feels real. Simple. It brings him back into his body, away from the familiar orbit of numbers. He sits down on the sofa. He doesn't open his laptop. He doesn't check his phone. Not out of discipline, but because the urge isn't there anymore. Kevin realizes something. The urge to run comes from the belief that if he stops, everything will fall apart. But tonight, everything is still standing. Nothing collapses. Nothing demands. He leans back and lets his head rest. His eyes drift half closed. Breath in, then out. Slower. Between the breaths, there's a small pause. In that pause, there's no goal to reach. No wheel that needs spinning. If you're listening and you recognize this habit of running in your own mind, from one thought straight into the next, tonight you might try standing still for a single beat. You don't have to stop forever. Just don't run a little longer. The wheel slows down when there's no force pushing it. Kevin stands and walks to the bedroom. Lights turn off behind him. When he lies down, he doesn't adjust the pillow again and again. He doesn't search for the perfect position. He just lets his weight be held. There's a quiet kind of safety in being supported without having to do anything. One last thought flickers light as a firefly. I did enough for today. Kevin doesn't hold on to it. There's no need. It dissolves like everything else when it isn't gripped. His breathing slows. The wheel in his mind doesn't stop completely, but it turns slowly enough that it no longer makes noise. And in that slowing, his body knows what comes next. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's perfectly fine. You're not missing anything. The wheel can wait until morning. Tonight you don't need to run. And if you're still awake, that's okay too. Just lie still a little longer. Let the quiet widen and allow the familiar motion to pass on its own. Tonight you don't need to go anywhere. Just step out of the wheel and rest. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.